In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, part 3 of our series on Ephesians. If you want to hear parts 1 and 2, there they are on YouTube. Go find them. Part 3 takes us into the second section of this letter, beginning at the beginning of chapter 4. Having had the theology in chapters 1 to 3, we now get from chapter 4 onwards the application. Some of the application in later chapters is stuff that we, for very good reasons, find quite difficult. Things like, wives obeying their husbands, slaves obeying their masters, all that sort of stuff. We find it difficult for very good reasons. Because whenever you have a text that is about the application of a theology, you are instantly into something that is time-specific, something that relates to a particular group of people where they are at that time and in that place. And so what we have from chapter 4 onwards in Ephesians is not a rule book to follow, but an example of how one community understood the application of the theology that they had been taught to how they should live in their day. Our job then, when considering these chapters of Ephesians, is to look at them and to ask the question, okay, the theology we've had in chapters 1 to 3, but also the experience of that community, how might those things speak to us right now? Because certainly not literally. Interestingly, of course, this section on application begins, surprise, surprise, with theology. It begins actually with a little introduction to the fact that we're on to something new, but then all of a sudden we get into theological, some people even think creedal statements. There is one body and one spirit, just as you were called in the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, etc., etc. Some scholars have even argued that what we've got here is a formula to be used in the baptism service. And so what we've actually got is liturgical text. Once again, you'll recall that we had one of those liturgical texts last week. But what we do have here is a writer who is concerned about something really quite important for the church in the period that this community received this letter. And that's the question of unity. Why is unity important? Because one of the questions for the Christian community in the period that we're talking about in this letter is, how are we going to survive? Because we are in the in-between time. As I mentioned in week 1 of this series, we're almost certainly here dealing with a Deutero-Pauline letter, a letter that was written not by the Apostle Paul himself, but by his followers in the next generation down. And so we are, if you like, in the post-apostolic period. Those who had lived through the apostolic period, including, presumably, those who are receiving this letter, knew what the apostolic church looked like and knew how it worked. But we are not yet in the period where the church has become a hierarchy in terms of its structure. So we are in that in-between time. Thus, perhaps all this language about no longer being children, but having now to grow up and become adults in faith. Why? Well, because Daddy's not there anymore. St. Paul has departed the scene in person. So with all of that in mind, we find ourselves in this particular text looking at how one writer addresses a community about what it's going to mean for that community to find a way to be church when the way they used to be church actually just is not going to quite work anymore. What are some of the things that this community has to consider? Well, unity is certainly one, and that's laboured at some length in the first few verses. But the other thing that is laboured at considerable length in the later part is the question of who's going to do what. who's going to be what. You know, it doesn't say some will be bishops and some will be priests and some will be deacons and some will be lay people. No, it says something quite different. Some will be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. Why? To equip the saints, every one of us, for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, for building up the church. The writer seems to be envisaging that particular individuals within the community are going to take on these various characteristics that perhaps had previously been associated with the one person of Paul, who was himself an apostle, a prophet of sorts, an evangelist certainly, a pastor certainly, a teacher certainly. No longer one, but now many. Put another way, boys and girls, who's going to step up for which role is what's being said to this community. Because the way it used to work is not the way it needs to work now. Now, in our day, of course, we are not coming out of the apostolic period in the church. We have no St. Paul standing or lying in the grave in front of us, wondering what we're going to do next because he's no longer there. Rather, perhaps, where we're at is at the end time, if I can put it that way, of the period of the hierarchical church, certainly as it's been understood up until now. I think really the hierarchical church that was invented as the solution to the end of the apostolic church, it took a while to sort itself out, but by the time of Constantine you're pretty much there. Whilst the hierarchical church took quite some time to sort itself out, it's been there pretty much in the same form for quite a long time, until perhaps the cracks started to show in a major way in the Reformation period 500 years ago. And in a sense, what's been happening ever since is that the church has been trying to work out how can we be who we are in a different model. And after 500 years of thinking about that, and in fact sacrificing unity in order to be able to think about that and to act on it, after 500 years of sacrificing unity in order to have that conversation, I wonder whether what we've got to now, certainly in the West, is something of a crunch point, where even in the churches that have hierarchy still as the way in which they are structured, we see that the cracks are so big that they can no longer be denied. But, just like the author of this letter, we cannot yet see, I don't think, what it is that is to come next for the church. The author of this letter still sees the ministry of the church in terms of the apostolic ministry, even though he can recognise that things are moving on and have got to a point where the apostolic paradigm doesn't work anymore. We, I think, still see things in terms of the way that the hierarchical church operates as being the way in which we operate, because that's what we know, and yet we can see that it is no longer what it once was and never can be again. But just as this author could not possibly have envisaged the development of the hierarchical church, so we cannot possibly yet, I don't think, envisage what it is that is going to replace the structure of church as we currently understand it. All right, well, that's all a bit depressing, really, isn't it? Because we find ourselves in this uncomfortable in-between space. What are the consequences of being in an uncomfortable in-between space? Well, we get some of them here. We become a little bit like children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. We get into this position where the church actually is a bit of a mess. Does that sound familiar? What are the solutions that are proposed by the theology of this letter that might, if not quite get us out of the mess, at least enable us to ride over the waves of the mess so that we can come safely in the boat, to coin another phrase, arrive safely in the boat on the other side, at least vaguely intact, with the fundamentals of the theology still there, even if we can't quite recognise the structures. Well, the solution offered by this letter is pretty blunt. Speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. Telling the truth, telling it like it is, but not in a way that says, ha ha ha, you got it wrong, I got it right, aren't I good, aren't I knowledgeable, aren't I fabulous? Not like that at all. Rather, speaking the truth in love is more about saying, I can see the pain and I can feel it too, where there is pain to feel and to see. And to be unafraid to name the things that are uncomfortable, and to be unafraid to name the things that are not working, and to be unafraid to name the fact that we might not yet have the answers about what some of those things are, or might be, or might become. In the meantime, we do have one thing in common with this community. We need to work out who's going to do what in order to bring this church that is a bit of a mess into a church that is whatever God is calling the church to be next. The list offered in this letter, I think, is still a relevant one. Some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, some teachers. Some within our communities are going to be called to each of these roles individually, but I think, in fact, I almost would say that I know, that it's not just an individual who is called to each of these tasks, but actually communities that are called to each of these tasks. For so long as the church has been moving into this period of decline, we have moved to become simply pastors. Let's look after one another. Let's be nice. That is the solution. Let's all become pastoral. It's important to be pastoral. I'm not knocking pastoral. But when we become communities that are merely pastoral, and do not have communities within our church that are apostolic, that are sent, communities that are prophetic, communities that are evangelical with a small e, communities that preach the gospel, communities that teach. When our church is composed only of communities that are pastoral, which is, I think, one of the big problems with the Anglican parish model as it currently stands, when we only have pastoral communities, we miss out on all of those other things, such that actually the church will just simply get more and more dysfunctional until perhaps God finally calls it into something new. And so my question, with which I end, is this. If some communities are apostolic, some communities are prophetic, some communities are evangelical with a small e, some communities are pastoral, some communities teach, some communities perhaps do more than one of these, which one or which ones are we? Let me add another question. Which one or which ones could we be? Let me add a third question. Which one or which ones should we be? And a fourth question. Which one, which ones is God calling us to be?